They say a man should always be surrounded by love, by friends, by noise, but what if strength was built, not in crowds, but in quiet? There are men who don't fear solitude, not because they've given up on connection, but because they've found something deeper, the courage to face themselves without distractions in the stillness. They begin to see clearly what truly matters, what must be released. And who they're becoming. This video is an invitation into that silence, the kind that sharpens your mind, steadies your emotions, and frees you from the need to be understood. If you've ever felt the urge to step back from the world, not to escape, but to grow, this is your space. Because walking alone isn't an absence of love. It's the presence of self-awareness. And it may just be the beginning of a life led not by noise, but by clarity, intention, and inner strength. Walking alone, the choice of a free man, not a lonely one. There is an image that unsettles many. A man living alone, no girlfriend, no romantic relationships. They call it loneliness, silent sorrow, a sign of lack and failure. But there are those who walk this path, not because they have to, but because they choose to, not because no one loves them, but because they know true value doesn't lie in having someone beside them, but in being able to stand strong on their own. Modern society teaches men that success must come with the image of a partner by their side, a perfect home, someone to come back to each night and share stories with. They're not wrong, but they're not entirely right either. Because there's another kind of man, the kind who walks in silence, not to escape love, but because he's diving deeper into the journey of self-understanding. This man is not afraid of solitude. He understands that being alone is not something to avoid, but a necessary space for growth. In the quiet, things long forgotten begin to surface, the inner voice, emotions that were never listened to, wounds that were never healed. He no longer rushes to fill the void with messages, hurried conversations, or fleeting relationships. He chooses to stay with himself. And it is there that something strange happens. The long-buried tension slowly unravels. The anxiety that once constantly loomed in the noisy outside world begins to dissolve as he learns to slow down and listen inward. Not everyone who lives alone finds peace, but the one who chooses solitude with mindfulness may reach a very different kind of peace, clarity in thought, strength in decision, and a mind no longer pulled by the need to be understood or accompanied. Walking alone is not a sign of lack. It is a declaration, a choice of freedom, a journey others may not understand. But the one walking it knows well he is returning to himself, and that is the beginning of true strength, self-reliance. When you stop waiting for someone to save you. When a man lives alone, he quickly realizes one thing: no one is going to do anything for him. No girlfriend to share chores, no one to remind him to sleep early or eat well, no one to help manage finances or offer support. When he's burned out, everything falls on one person, him. And that is where a power begins that many never touch. The power of complete self-reliance. At first, it can be overwhelming. A missed bill, a skipped meal, a messy room. No one's coming to fix it. No one's reminding him. No one's coming to save him. But instead of letting it become pressure, he starts to shift his perspective. These small things, cooking a meal, keeping the room clean, managing expenses, now become survival lessons. Each small task becomes a discipline. Each mistake is an opportunity to see what needs improvement. And each time he solves a problem on his own, it's a firm step on the path to self-mastery. Living alone forces him to face reality head-on. No one is responsible for his life but himself. If he doesn't act, he'll fall behind. If he doesn't manage his emotions, his money, his health. No one's patching up those holes for him, but precisely because no one else is there. He becomes more alert with each choice. He knows that if he doesn't cook, he'll go hungry. If he doesn't sleep enough, he'll burn out. If he doesn't control his emotions, he'll harm himself, and so he begins to act with intention, not because anyone asked him to, but because he owes it to himself. Stoic philosophy emphasizes this as a truth. The truly wealthy man is the one who needs little, and the strongest man is the one who needs no rescuing. Seneca once wrote, "He who is content with little is the richest." For the man who chooses to live alone, that contentment is not resignation, it is understanding that value does not lie in what can be borrowed from others, but in what can be created for oneself. He starts fixing the leaky faucet. Instead of calling a plumber, he teaches himself to invest instead of borrowing advice. He handles emotional crises through journaling, meditation, exercise instead of waiting for someone to console him, and in these acts, he builds a solid foundation for calmness, for inner strength, for the ability to remain grounded amid life's upheavals. This isn't just independence in a material sense. This is a reshaping of the inner world. He no longer waits for someone to rescue him, nor does he need to prove that he's okay, because he knows each day. He takes another step on his own, firmly, quietly, and each step brings him closer to the strongest version of himself. No one's coming to save him, but he no longer needs saving. He has learned to do it himself with calm and mindful presence. True silence. When you dare to sit with yourself, in a world where noise is the default, silence becomes unfamiliar. Few people truly sit with themselves without a device in hand. Music to fill the gap, or a message to remind them they exist. But a man who lives alone in the truest sense is not just physically alone. He is someone who dares to face the silence within. He doesn't rush to turn on music when he gets home. He doesn't scroll through his phone when he feels empty. He lets silence fill his living space, not because he's ascetic, but because he knows that is where the mind begins to speak honestly. In that quiet, suppressed thoughts rise questions no one ever asked him now demand his answers. How am I living? Why do I feel so drained? What really matters to me? The anxiety, stress, and internal chaos many feel daily often do not come from the outside world, but from the fact that they've never truly listened to themselves. They run from it through work, fun, relationships. But the one who chooses silence goes the other way. He lets emptiness teach him to grow. No one is there to soothe him. No one leads the way. There is only one person in need of understanding, and it's himself. And that's where a powerful shift occurs. His mind begins to organize. Itself, what once seemed tangled, becomes clear, without the distractions of endless conversations. He starts to observe emotions, recognize reactions, and understand what is really driving him. It is not a comfortable journey because it demands courage, but it is the only path to true clarity. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. But to find that place, you must dare to go in, and going in doesn't mean reading a few quotes or listening to a motivational podcast. It means sitting down in silence, facing the chaos in your mind, and not running away. For the man who lives alone, silence is no longer an enemy. It is where he finds clarity no relationship can give. It is where his biggest decisions are made, not from reaction, but from observation, not from others' advice, but from honesty with himself. When you dare to sit with yourself in unmasked silence, you see more clearly where you're headed, what you're carrying, and what you need to let go of to live lighter. That's when you stop being swept away by passing emotions. Stop acting just to fill the void. You begin to live mindfully, little by little, in each moment. And in that silence, you no longer feel lonely. You begin to feel present. And presence, not crowds, is what makes a person truly strong from within. Emotions are not for reacting, but for observing and choosing. When you live alone, there is no one around to listen to your complaints. Every time emotions rise, no one to vent to, or to seek comfort from when your spirit dips. In that separation, a man has no choice but to learn the most vital skill on the path to maturity: emotional mastery. Mastery does not mean suppression. It's not pretending to be calm when you're seething inside. On the contrary, mastery means facing the emotion as it arises, not judging, not denying, but observing it like a guest. That's when you stop being swept away by feelings like a wave, and instead stand and watch them pass, choosing your response rather than reacting. The man who lives alone learns this not from books, but from life, with no one to console him when things fall apart. He learns to sit with the pain without rushing to escape, with no one beside him when his mind is restless. He must observe the emotional storms within and quietly restore order. Each burst of anger, each wave of sadness, each old fear, he lets them all surface, then pass without giving them control. And that makes all the difference. While others are triggered by a word, a message, or a glance, he remains composed, not because he feels nothing, but because he has trained his mind not to react impulsively. He knows that actions born from fleeting emotion often lead to regret, but actions born from mindful observation yield deeper and longer-lasting outcomes. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside. Events realize this, and you will find strength." This isn't an abstract motto. It is a daily practice. For the man who lives alone, he journals to clarify thoughts. He meditates to step back from emotions. He trains his body to remind himself that both body and spirit need discipline. From there, he develops a unique calm, not innate, but forged through inner discipline. He is no longer easily offended, not caught in dramatic relationships, not pulled by unresolved negative emotions. And because of this, he makes wiser decisions not out of avoidance, but because he understands his emotions so well that they no longer dominate him. Emotions are not the enemy, but if you let them control you, you become a victim of your own mind. The Stoic man does not reject emotion. He walks through it with mindful observation. And on the other side of that emotional wave lies true freedom. Behind silence lies a kind of freedom no one teaches you. Freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. True freedom is when you no longer feel compelled to act against your own values. And for the man who lives alone, that freedom arises from a place others may easily overlook: silence. No more meaningless arguments. No more pleasing others just to keep the peace. No more pressure from invisible expectations: what gift to buy, where to go on weekends, or how to become the ideal man. He doesn't need to paint himself in a way that pleases others. He doesn't need to hide his true feelings just to avoid offending someone in his own space. He can be himself fully and honestly. Living alone allows him to preserve his energy. He is no longer drained by relationships rooted in obligation or guilt. He doesn't need to spend money to impress. He doesn't need to prove his worth through pre-programmed romantic gestures. Every action he takes, whether it's investing, learning a new skill, or simply tidying up his space, comes from conscious choice, not social momentum. Epictetus once said, "Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." For the man who embraces solitude as his companion, This becomes a way of life he needs little, not because he's emotionally poor or lacking in experience, but because he has trimmed away what drains the life within him. In today's world, many spend their lives maintaining things they don't truly want, just because they fear losing the approval of others. They trade time, freedom, and even integrity just to hold on to what's considered normal. But the man who chooses to live alone is different. He doesn't fear losing someone because he's learned not to lose himself. From that freedom, he becomes more decisive. Every choice, from work to where he lives to how he spends his time, needs no validation. He can shift careers, change lifestyles, try something new without explaining himself, not out of recklessness, but because he's no longer bound by the invisible strings that most people don't realize are controlling them. That freedom isn't loud. It doesn't need declaration. It comes in quiet moments, sitting alone, sipping tea, writing a journal entry, fully aware that his life, from thoughts to actions, is entirely his own. This is the kind of freedom they don't teach in school. It's not found in textbooks, but it is the greatest reward for those who dare to walk alone, not to be different, but to be true. When you're no longer pulled around, you start living with direction. When you live in the social current, surrounded by friends, family, and partners, it's easy to lose yourself without realizing it. Advice, expectations, and pre-packaged success paths begin to shape how you think, act, and choose without actually coming from within. You wake up not for your own goals, but in sync with someone else's rhythm. But when you live alone, everything slows down. No one's rushing you into their pace. No one's unintentionally leading you off your path. And in that stillness, you begin to hear your inner voice more clearly. Old questions, once vague, begin to take shape. What do I truly want? Why am I really alive? What is my deepest purpose? And the wonderful part is, you don't just have time to think about these things, you have space to act on them. No longer distracted by meaningless meetings, no longer delaying your journey because of other people's commitments. With each passing day, you reclaim more energy for what truly matters, building the person you want to become. Philosopher Epictetus once said, "First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do." It sounds simple, but for most, it's something they never achieve because they're always being pulled by judgment, by short-term temptations, by fear of letting others down. But when you truly live alone, you no longer need anyone to confirm that you're on the right path. You don't need to share your values to get applause. You don't need to chase trends to feel like you exist. You step back and begin to steer your life with clarity. Your thinking becomes sharper because you're no longer drowning in conflicting advice. Your decisions become firmer because you're no longer torn between what you want and what others want from you. You begin to act not to gain praise, not to avoid criticism, but because it aligns with your own values. The man who lives alone is often misunderstood as someone who lacks direction, but in reality, he has something many never attain, a goal he chose himself, and a life structured around it. He doesn't do everything. He does what matters. He's not trying to move faster than others. He's focused on moving truer and deeper. When you're no longer pulled around, you can finally stand still. When you stand still, you can observe, and when you observe long and deep enough, you begin to see the road ahead clearly. No rush, no noise, just steadfastness. Living alone doesn't make you lost. It gives you, perhaps for the first time, the chance to choose a direction you truly believe in. And that's what sets you apart. Not because you're going faster, but because you're no longer being led astray. Not connecting out of need, but out of choice. One of the most common misconceptions about men who live alone is that they are cold, isolated, and incapable of building relationships. But the truth is quite the opposite. It's those who know how to live alone who often build the most meaningful connections, because they don't seek others to fill a void, but to genuinely connect. Most people maintain relationships out of habit or emotional dependence. They talk, not because they want to share, but because they fear being forgotten. They date, not because they're truly in sync, but because they're afraid of being alone. They keep friends, not for real value, but out of fear of being left behind. And from that, connections become heavy, pressured, and lacking sincerity because they don't come from freedom, but from fear. The man who lives alone is different. He has spent enough time by himself to realize that loneliness is less frightening than living inauthentically. In a fake relationship, he doesn't connect to be loved, validated, or comforted. He only connects when there is resonance, depth, and alignment in values, because he needs no one to fill him. He can be selective, and it is precisely that selectiveness that creates his aura of strength. He doesn't show up everywhere. He doesn't try to be friends with everyone, but when he is present, his presence is complete, undistracted. When he listens, he genuinely wants to understand, not to respond or impress. When he shares, it's from deep experience, not to prove he's interesting. Seneca once wrote, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you yourself can improve." For the man who lives alone, this isn't a moral guideline, it's a way of life. He doesn't need a crowd of friends, just a few who help him become deeper, stronger, and more honest with himself. That doesn't mean he rejects love. He's not cold or closed off, but he's solid enough not to rush into love. He's clear enough to see who is truly worth walking beside him and who is just passing through. And if there's no one suitable, he continues alone peacefully, without resentment or demand. When you no longer fear losing someone, you love more sincerely. When you no longer try to hold on to people, you connect more gently. And when you no longer need anyone to feel complete, you begin to build real relationships, fewer, deeper, and freer. The man who lives alone does not avoid connection. He only rejects dependence. And that's what makes him trustworthy, admirable, in a world full of haste and fear of being left behind. He walks slowly but firmly because he knows the right connection is worth far more than 100 superficial ones. When nothing can shake you become your true self. Most people live in a defensive state. They fear being misunderstood, fear rejection, fear being disliked, fear unexpected change. And because of fear, they are easily shaken. A single judgment from someone else can unsettle them. A small failure can make them doubt themselves. A negative emotion from the outside can drag them into crisis. But there's a kind of person who doesn't live that way. A man who lives alone after going through enough moments of facing himself, after learning how to stand without anyone to hold him up, gradually becomes unmoved by life's storms, not because he is numb, but because he no longer allows anything external to define his inner worth. He no longer reacts to every criticism. He no longer seeks validation. He no longer needs to be understood because he understands himself. And from that deep understanding, a quiet strength begins to form, an inner power that depends on nothing, a kind of resilience that doesn't come from a cold exterior, but from inner stillness. The outside world is always in flux. People change, jobs change, emotions change. But the Stoic man does not get swept into that whirlwind. He has learned how to stay grounded amidst the uncontrollable. He doesn't wish for the world to comply with him. He trains himself to receive things as they are, and to respond with reason and principle. Seneca once wrote, "A wise man is content with whatever comes to him." But to reach that state, he had to go through many layers of ego, overcoming impulses, managing fears, and practicing calmness every single day, not by escaping reality, but by facing it with steadfast resolve. He no longer sees failure as collapse, but as information for adjustment. He's no longer ruled by other people's emotions, because he's learned that others' feelings are not his responsibility. And he's no longer shaken by praise or attack, because his worth is no longer built on the eyes of others. The man who lives alone, after a long journey of observation and practice, reaches a state of inner invincibility. No one controls his mood, no one scripts his reactions. He no longer fears losing anything, because the most precious thing he already holds, freedom from within. And from that place, he becomes himself fully, undisturbed, undirected. He doesn't need noise to prove he's strong. He doesn't need to be better than anyone to feel enough. The silence within him says it all. In a world full of chaos and anxiety, men like him are rare, not because they don't feel, but because they're not led by feelings, not because they don't face hardship, but because they know how to walk through it without losing themselves. And when nothing can shake you anymore, you begin to live as your truest self. The man who lives alone isn't weak. He's just strong enough not to pretend. There's a quiet but common stereotype that men who live alone are failures in love, incapable of commitment, lonely souls who lack the strength to love. But few understand that some men choose solitude, not because no one is beside them, but because they've grown strong enough not to need anyone to feel whole. Men who live alone have been called many things strange, closed off, indifferent, but they don't mind because they've outgrown the phase of living for others' approval. They don't need anyone to name their value because they've already found it within. In a world where everyone is trying to appear, to do it right, to be liked, the man who dares to be real, even alone, is the most courageous of all. He doesn't need to act like he's okay, doesn't need to hide his sadness, doesn't need to tense up just to prove something. He lives with the honesty of his inner world. When he's tired, he rests when he fails. He confronts it when he's wounded. He heals, and that absolute honesty with himself is the truest sign of inner strength. The Stoic man does not reject relationships. He does not deny love, but he knows clearly relationships are never a fix for inner emptiness. He's tried filling that void with rushed romance, with efforts to belong to someone, and then he realized no one can make him feel complete if he cannot do that for himself. Instead of striving to be loved, he learns to love himself rightly through discipline, through principled living, through refusing to betray his own values just to be accepted, instead of looking for someone to lean on. He builds his foundation on inner clarity and resolve, and once he's strong enough to stand alone, he becomes ready to enter connection not from need, but from a desire to share fullness. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "It never ceases to amaze me. We all love ourselves more than other people, but care more about their opinions than our own." The man who lives alone understands this deeply. He no longer reshapes himself for outside approval. He doesn't live to please the crowd, and he doesn't lose himself just to keep some company. That's why he's not as easily wounded as others. Assume not because his heart is closed, but because he opens it wisely. At the right time, with the right people, he doesn't need much, but what he chooses to keep holds meaning. And in that measure, he becomes stronger than all those loudly chasing love while fearing the silence of solitude. The man who lives alone lacks nothing. He has simply walked through enough wounds to understand. Peace doesn't come from having someone next to you, but from being reconciled with yourself. He's not weak. He just no longer needs to pretend to be strong. And perhaps that's the rarest strength of all, living mindfully. when you observe yourself instead of being swept away. Most people live in reflex mode. They get triggered, they react. They feel sad, they try to forget. They get angry, they lash out. Life moves as a stream of emotions turned into actions without pause, without observation, without real choice. But the man who lives alone, after a long time training in silence, begins to realize something. Freedom doesn't come from doing whatever emotions tell you, but from the ability not to do what emotions demand. Mindful living is not a lofty concept. It's a very practical skill and the key to self-mastery. It's the ability to pause before reacting, to observe the rising emotion without being carried by it. When angry, he notices the fire building in his chest. When sad, he feels the heaviness settling in his mind. And instead of reacting on impulse, he breathes, he writes it down, he walks, he lets the emotional wave pass, and then chooses how to respond. There is no one beside him to regulate his mood, no one to remind him what to say or when to stay silent. So he must become the most attentive observer of his own mind. Every thought, every feeling, every behavior, he learns to watch them not through judgment, but with curious awareness, and from there, he begins to discern what comes from his true values and what is just programming from fear or instinct. That mindfulness doesn't arrive overnight. It's the result of hundreds of failures, thousands of quiet moments after missteps, but through persistence, he gradually builds a structured mind, no longer chaotic, no longer ruled by fleeting emotion. And from that space, his decisions grow clearer, more consistent. The man who lives alone slowly becomes a quiet place he can trust. He doesn't need to seek advice from everyone because he's developed the ability to analyze, reflect, and ask the right questions. Is this a real feeling or just a defense? Is this a value I believe in or someone else's expectation? Am I acting by choice or out of fear? In a world filled with stimulation and pressure to respond instantly, the person who can pause and observe himself holds the greatest power. The power to choose how to live and how to respond in line with his values. Mindfulness doesn't make you perfect, but it makes you honest, free, and stronger in the face of life's chaos. No one teaches you this in school, but if you live alone long enough, deep enough, and with enough courage to observe instead of react, you'll begin to see that this is a gift, because no one else is controlling you anymore, and nothing pulls you out of control. You are living in each moment with full awareness and with full authority over yourself. And perhaps that is the most peaceful and powerful state a man can reach. Being alone is not retreating. It's stepping deeply into yourself. These 10 parts of the journey are not about isolation. They don't glorify detachment or deny the value of love and connection. They offer another lens, a reflection on the silent growth of those who dare to live alone. No applause, no witnesses, but each step, each choice, each moment spent staying with oneself is quietly forming a person who cannot be swept away. The man who chooses to walk alone isn't doing it to be unusual. He's simply returning to himself in the most authentic, mindful, and liberated version. And if you too are on that path quietly, uncertain at times, but deeply aware, then know this: you are not lost. You are just going deeper into the inner space where the strongest kind of power is born. Because in the end, freedom isn't about how many people stand beside you, but whether the world still controls you. And peace isn't the absence of chaos, but the ability to stay clear within the chaos. Living alone, if passed through with observation, mindfulness, and discipline, does not lead to emptiness. It leads to a very different depth, a place where you not only know who you are, but also know why you've chosen to live this way. And when you know that, you are no longer afraid to be alone, because you've found the most important companion of all yourself.